Well, the CO-CABE conference has always felt like family. Being greeted at the registration table, seeing colleagues, friends, mentors. The conference is a time to renew our passion for equity and excellence through bilingual education for emerging bilingual students and families. We re-energize ourselves by simply being in each other's presence. I don't know about you, but I need some re-energizing. Over the course of this last year, I find myself feeling very exhausted and more than usual. And I find myself feeling very tired of having the same conversations over and over again. Advocacy is not easy work. Leading for equity and excellence can feel lonely and can feel and seem like an endless upward climb. Often I find myself, or I feel like I might be, the only voice for equity for emerging bilingual students in the room. I'm sure all of you can relate to that. So let us use our time together to boost our energy, to lead and advocate. If we were in person, we would probably be sitting around big, large, round tables, enjoying coffee or tea, planning our sessions, giving hugs and catching up on each other's lives. We may have even dressed up a little bit from head to toe. Now, I feel the absence of that, but I still feel the spirit of family. I still feel the spirit of CO-CABE. I yesterday watched chat boxes fill up with like greetings and compliments, gratitudes and appreciation. I listened to students read their proud to be bilingual essays and feel their orgullo, and they always make me cry. I saw questions and answers start, and people seeking each other for deepening understanding, and many willing to share and support each other with answering each other's questions. And I felt extremely fortunate to hear Patrick Warito's invocation in an Indigenous language and watch his daughter dance at the powwow yesterday. I also feel lucky to have watched and learned the names and significance of several Indigenous dances at the powwow. Oh, and in the morning yesterday at the keynote, I found myself clapping alone in my house and yelling, "That's right, right on," at Dr. Jose Medina's keynote speech. Well, I found myself feeling proud and being re-energized by being present with all of you through this screen right here. We are finding ways to connect, and we are finding ways to continue to learn and support each other in our passion. So things aren't so bad. In fact, we have a few perks that we don't have when we are in person. We can attend every session asynchronously. We won't miss a thing. There's no need to get together early in the morning. You go to this one, I go to that one. We'll come back here at noon. We'll show materials. Okay, then we'll figure out what we're going to do in the afternoon. We don't have to do that. We can attend each one. And we can attend wearing slippers and pajamas if we want, or maybe just dress up from the waist up. So sit back with your coffee or your tea, kick up your feet, and partake in our shared passion by participating in your own way. I'm Amy Fairbanks. I'm the Secretary for CO-CABE, and I welcome you to day 2 of CO-CABE's first virtual conference, Leading for Equity and Excellence Through Bilingual Education 2021. Now, before I introduce our keynote speakers, I have some housekeeping items. So I'm going to read this so I don't mess it up. Okay, so please continue to visit exhibitors and earn points. You can earn stamps each time you sign up for deals and offerings, post a comment, or like a booth. Collect a stamp from each exhibitor to be entered into our raffle for a $100 Amazon gift card. We also have community leadership contests where you can earn points for your participation in the community board, polls, and session feedback. That winner will also receive a $100 Amazon gift card. And there's even a photo contest because we have to have likes. So the photo with the most likes will win a $25 gift card from the Tattered Cover Bookstore. And a reminder, don't miss the Folklorico Show Fiesta Colorado today at 1 p.m. And then please stay with us for happy hour at 4:30. It is a great opportunity to network and interact with others in the field of bilingual education, and it'll be fun. It'll be It's always fun to have a drink with colleagues. Okay, so now I want you to do me a favor and take out a pen. And I want you to write down these 3 names. You got a pen and paper? This is really important. Write it down. Write down the name Daniel Garcia. He is CO-CABE's Chief Operations Officer. Write down Lucinda Sotero Gonzalez. And then write down this name, Valeria Praga Rodriguez. Those are 2 board members. I would like you to do me a favor and find their names in the attendees. There's a little Whova app and we have attendees. Find their name and send them a message of gratitude. They have worked so hard to bring this amazing virtual conference to you. And I want to thank them personally, but it would be great if you sent them a little message of thanks as well. So now, I would like to introduce to you today's keynote speaker. Dr. Sue Hopewell may not remember the day we first met, but I certainly do. It was quite a number of years ago, and Sue, I won't tell them how long it was. I was just beginning a new position at as a bilingual schools coordinator for Boulder Valley School District. And I was so excited because I was going to be able to work in 3 escuelas bilingües. So I went to the first school and I got a tour and was introduced to people. And I was shown around this amazing school. And we stopped at a 4th grade classroom. And that is where I met Dr. Hopewell. She was busy teaching. And her room was amazing. It was a resource for learning. There was vocabulary, words everywhere, concepts, and the kids were engaged and completely working together. I'm pretty sure she didn't even care that I was there. But I knew from the moment that I met Sue, I had a lot to learn from her. And as it turns out, I was right. I haven't stopped learning from Dr. Hopewell. In fact, I rely on her research and her guidance in my daily work in my school district every day. So Dr. Hopewell earned her PhD in the Division of Educational Equity and Cultural Diversity at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research focuses on strengthening biliteracy education for Spanish English bilingual children in the United States. She is currently examining the strategic use of Spanish during literacy-based ELD and has an ongoing interest in strengthening oracy instruction. Her K-12 teaching experience includes 8 years as a classroom teacher in a dual language elementary school and 4 years as the literacy coach in a maintenance bilingual program. She is currently associate professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder and the director of Literacy Squared. So join me by taking a moment to get comfortable. Breathe in and breathe out. Now, think about setting an intention for today. How may we continue to lead for equity and excellence through bilingual education together? Please pause and now focus your attention right here to this screen. And please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Sue Hopewell.
Wow, Amy, that was an amazing introduction. And yeah, I'm sorry I don't remember that day. I do remember you working for Boulder Valley, so I do remember those days. And I remember working together. And what I'm reminded as I'm sitting here is it's probably been a decade since I was on the CABE board, but you and I were there together and you're back. So I'm grateful to you for that. But it's reminding me that maybe I need to step up again. Yeah, well, I'm going to call on all of us to step up today. So, you got to walk the walk, I think. Good morning, everyone. I am Sue Hopewell. I am not Jose Medina. I am not going to make you dance, but I won't discourage you from dancing. So if you would like to move your body this morning, please go for it. This also won't be interactive, though it will be a call for action. I hope we can all keep in mind his admonition yesterday that we're all a hot mess, right? That we need to consider what it means to do anti-racist work and not performative work. What is the real work? Who's doing it? How are we engaging? And I love his style. He's substance and entertainment, but it's not mine. So sit back. If you want to turn off your screens and just listen, that'll be fine. I also want to just start by acknowledging that we're all in different places in terms of the language we use. And I've tried to be thoughtful about the language I'm going to use today, but I'm happy always to be educated and to unlearn. So let me know if there are things I should be thinking about, but please know I also mean no disrespect to any human being present here today. I have a daily gratitude practice. And this morning, after I tried to remember why the snow was a good thing, after shoveling, I really felt a lot of gratitude for CABE. And so before I jump in, I want to begin by thanking the CABE board for what they've put together here. It has been extraordinary. Yesterday morning was the most inspired I've been in a long time. But I also want to thank them, appreciate them for three particular things in what has been a really difficult year. 2020 has been hard on all of us. And I feel like CABE did an extraordinary job in trying to identify our community's needs and putting structures in place to address them. So I'm going to call attention to three things. First, their free webinar series, Si Se Puede. In a year when things were really difficult, teachers were being asked to work online and in hybrid modes, CABE asked the question, how can we support? How can we help? And they put together this series. If you were unable to attend, I encourage you to get on their website and look at the recorded sessions. They were free. They are freely available now. They followed those up with the second thing, and those were cafecitos, right? Saturday morning sessions when educators could come together to talk about like interests. Again, we need inspiration throughout the year, not just in February when we can get a conference together. And the last thing, and maybe the most important thing, was the work they did to ensure that families were informed that they could opt out of taking the access test this year with no consequence. That was no little thing. Districts weren't doing it, right? CABE stepped up and got that message out. And so I'm grateful this morning. The CO-CABE board has been tireless in naming and trying to find solutions to the issues facing bilingual teachers and families, and have advocated and educated on our behalf throughout the year. And for that, we should all be grateful. And so I don't know what they can see on the back end. I've minimized my screen so I can't see all of you, but if you wanted to use your reaction buttons right now to show some love, I think that would be completely appropriate. I would be asking you to give them a round of applause or to do the deaf applause, but they deserve our appreciation. So for those of you who have known me for any length of time, you know when asked to speak, I generally land on topics of instruction. I am a bilingual educator at heart. I miss my dual language teaching days more than I can say. I know that in my teaching days, when I attended the CO-CABE conference, I went to gain new ideas for my classroom. But 2020 has not been an ordinary year, and today I will not do what I ordinarily do. Recently, I was asked what I know about myself now that I didn't know at 6 a.m. on January 6th before our Capitol building was stormed by rioters. And I surprised myself when I realized that my answer was how angry I could be and how crystal clear it was for me that we could not go on as we were. I also realized that I was clinging by my fingernails to the importance of the arrival of a new administration. There was a promise, right, of fresh leadership, of hope, and that was sustaining me. But what I also recognized in that moment was that the new administration would not be able to do it alone. And that like our CO-CABE board, we need to advocate and educate for the changes we want to see in the world. So the title of my talk today is Reclaiming Our Roots, Bilingualism as Activism in Service to Social Justice. And let me warn you right up front, it will be a call to action at a time when I know we're all exhausted. We've been besieged and locked down by a global pandemic that preyed upon the weak, the sick, and the poor. It's killed over 500,000 of our brothers and sisters. And I have no doubt that many of you were close to someone who passed, or that you were friends with someone who lost someone. Many of the losses, perhaps the majority, were Black and brown folks. A pandemic that was avoidable or at least manageable but for the last administration. A pandemic that has put teachers, families, and children at risk as we've struggled to balance health risks against our desires to come together for face-to-face settings. Millions are out of work. Millions are food insecure. They've lost their homes. We are still very much living this reality. And while there's hope, and there is hope, we are not yet out of the woods. And so you, teachers, administrators, you've stepped up to be there for families like never before. Of course you're exhausted. Of course you're exhausted. The pandemic alone would have been enough to feed our exhaustion, but it wasn't the only major event demanding our attention this year. We faced a lot of challenges, and I would be remiss if in the middle or the end of the 45th anniversary of Black History Month, a month we only first celebrated in 1976, and which is a sorry response to the continued lack of diversity in our nation's curricula, I did not also raise the so-called racial reckoning we are experiencing as a country. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. 3 names I wish I didn't know. 3 that simply represent the many racially aggravated deaths of Black and brown people at the hands of authorities happening every day in this country. And while we have labeled the responses this year a reckoning, and they have certainly begun to have concrete impact in the form of the removal of Confederate symbolism, statues, flags, the rise in the sale and consumption of books dedicated to anti-racism, people reconsidering how to redistribute funds so that police are better trained and monitored while also providing better mental and general social services. We have a long way to go. As Michelle Norris reminded us in December in her Washington Post op-ed, we should think carefully about labeling this a reckoning. These are her words. A reckoning is not an action item on a wish list. It is a thing, an accomplishment, a checked box. A reckoning by definition refers to the moment when we finally deal with an ugly situation. It is more than just admitting there is a problem. She reminds us there's a lot of work to do, but we cannot dismantle what we do not name. History matters, and we need to consult it and consider it as we move forward. So what does this have to do with bilingual education and reclaiming our roots? I will argue here today that US schools, both public and private, are also in need of a reckoning. They are founded on a colonial past that promotes a particular vision of culture and history at the demise and expense of others. The larger colonial project is both elitist and exclusionary. Our country's motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one, suggests that there is chaos in plurality. It is the foundation for a social order that suggests one nation, one language. And while we argue that we uphold democratic ideals now, especially on the heels of the legacy of the last administration, it is probably a good idea to remind ourselves that a tactic of totalitarianism and autocracy is the erasure of languages, histories, cultures. We need to be willing to acknowledge that we participate in a system that largely sustains racial and linguistic hierarchies. And then we need to fight like hell to resist, to challenge, to change. As bilingual educators, we have both the opportunity and the obligation to push back, to upend, to dismantle. The inclusion of a plethora of languages, cultures, histories, and literacies invites disagreement and dissent. And I will argue in the few minutes I have with you here today that these are good things. That when we invite different worldviews and different ways of knowing and being in the world, we create hope, hopeful alternatives to what actually is. As bilingual educators, we need to ask ourselves, how stridently are we ensuring that our students maintain not only their languages, but their cultures, literacies, art traditions, legacies? How closely are we examining the role of whiteness in our bilingual and dual language programs? How are we actively pushing back against the hegemony of English? And finally, when and how do we resist letting English language assessments and Western-based curricula define and delineate our programs? We must envision and imagine alternatives. In my call for activism today, I'm also going to ask that we remember what we once imagined when we dreamed of bilingual education. It was to be a place of justice, a place of expansive thinking. It was going to do for bilingual learners what US public schools dedicated to monolingualism were unable to do. We had a vision that was optimistic and full of hope. And that's the legacy I want to restore and inspire today. I also, though, want to remind us that in the fight for our very existence, we were sometimes co-opted and reframed in ways that didn't do us any favors. Often, at the university in our foundations courses, when we're studying to get our CLD endorsements, we are versed in the legacy of the Bilingual Education Act of 1968 or the Lau v. Nichols case of 1974. We laud them as creating the conditions for the programs we have today. But when we remember them, we also need to keep in mind that these legislative acts and court rulings came out of a war on poverty and were founded primarily on a vision of bilingualism that cast those who entered schools speaking languages other than English as having problems that needed to be overcome. Proponents argued that offering innovative educational approaches to students in the early grades would diminish the dropout rate in the upper grades, a problem in need of a solution. The funding resources offered through the Bilingual Education Act originally were reserved for communities, entire communities, whose average income fell below the line of poverty, essentially creating what looked like a government-backed vision for innovative approaches to bilingual education that were handouts to poor Latino communities. It created a story in which mostly white men got to be saviors to poor brown folk. And I'm not arguing that good didn't come out of the war on poverty, but I do want us to keep in mind the history, keep it in perspective, to be cognizant of the framing at the beginning, in any case, at the legislative level, was rather deficit. And as researchers, many of us didn't help. In fact, conducting research about the efficacy of bilingual education, when we did this, we argued that bilingual education was justified because it ensured faster and better acquisition of English. These arguments appeased those that believed that speaking a language other than English was a problem in need of a solution. E pluribus unum, one nation, one language. Sometimes to get what you want, you play into the hands of those who would diminish you. Why, when we could have collected data on both the Spanish and English reading levels of students in our bilingual programs, did we only collect and report on the English? Why were we not arguing for the advantages of bilingualism and biculturalism rather than for better acquisition of English? I'm not naive. I understand the politics of fighting for and defending our programs. I know that the audience is rarely a room full of bilingual folks, and that what we won, at least in those early years, were transitional bilingual programs. But what they had as their outcome goal was English acquisition levels that would ensure that our babies could return to all English instruction as quickly as possible. What was often ignored and certainly not addressed were the broader political struggles and intolerances that resulted in racial and economic inequities. And I cannot help but wonder if we somehow inadvertently have contributed to the fears that create and recreate the conditions that maintain these racial and linguistic and economic inequities. So today, what I want to urge us to remember is that these deficit framings and these political and legal precedents that we often cite are not the whole story. At the same time that people of color, Latinos in particular, were being framed as deficient and in need of compensatory education that was designed to use a language other than English only as a vehicle to get students into all English education as quickly as possible, there were Latino leaders and families imagining richer possibilities, possibilities in which indigenous ways of knowing and communicating were valued, visions in which Spanish wasn't a tool for English acquisition, but a language linked intimately to identity, family, history, culture. A vision in which Spanish could never be valued only as a commodity to be used for the good of the market or when it provided access to a material benefit. A pluralistic vision based not on blaming the victim, but in understanding that historical inequities, economic challenges, and racial or linguistic rankings are largely the result of systems intentionally designed to maintain a hierarchy. What needed to be overcome was not an inability to speak English, but a system that privileged some while oppressing others. Latino families and leaders have a long history of challenging inequitable schooling. We could go back to the 1930s and highlight the Lemon Grove incident, or note how the Mendez family mounted a legal challenge to segregated schooling before Brown versus Board of Education was even a thing. We could fast forward to the 1960s and 70s and look at the activism of the Young Lords in Chicago, or the Brown Berets who got their start in Los Angeles. Today, though, at this Colorado conference, I want us to remember our very own Corki Gonzalez. In Corki's vision, bilingual education was not compensatory, but mandatory to create the conditions for a liberating education that might upend societal inequities in service to a more just world. I know that not all of you are familiar with Corki, so indulge me. Allow me to give you just a brief introduction. Rodolfo Corki Gonzalez was a Denver native. He grew up in the East Side Barrio. He graduated from Manual High School. He was a boxer, a poet, a political organizer, and activist. And while his interest in politics began in the 1940s, it was in the 1960s when he and others began what came to be called the Crusade for Justice. The Crusade centered Chicano nationalist politics and gave rise to the Denver Chicano movement. The Crusade for Justice highlighted and challenged societal inequities, but it went beyond political battles to include, create, promote art, music, culture, pride. Their fight against oppression, exploitation, racism challenged the colonial project. Rather than being ashamed, Corki and his colleagues taught the community to be proud of the languages they spoke and their ethnic heritages. They sponsored a Chicano Youth Liberation Conference in which 1,500 young people from all over the country, including those involved in the Young Lords and the Brown Berets, were brought together to Denver to create a revolutionary vision for La Raza. They were fighting for civil and human rights within the Latino community, understanding that the political and social conditions at the time were unsustainable. They were hurting la gente. I am asking us today to remember these roots as we think about how today's bilingual education can serve to create the foundation for a more just world. We too have to fight for civil and human rights. But not only did Corki believe in bilingual bicultural education, in 1971, before Lau v. Nichols, before we had a Black History Month, before we had most of the research that demonstrates the benefits of bilingual education, he founded Escuela Tlatelolco in Denver, a dual language school focused on building students' self-esteem through culturally relevant curricula. And while the school sadly closed its doors just recently after being in existence for 46 years, I think it's important to remember its motto: educating students, liberating minds. Educators in Escuela's community used to say, the ultimate goal is for young people to perceive education not only as the intellectual development of the individual for his or her personal benefit, but as a social orientation and development process responsible for social change, which will ultimately benefit the entire community. I am beseeching us as a community to remember that bilingual education was first and foremost to be a liberating education for Latinx youth. It was to lay the foundation for a better world. I can imagine that some of you, especially those in two-way dual language programs right now, perhaps even the CO-CABE board, are feeling a little uncomfortable. Like, I am advocating to recenter our Latin youth. You might be thinking, isn't bilingualism and biculturalism good for all? Did we invite someone to speak who's just trying to alienate those who would advocate bilingualism for all? And I assure you I'm not. But I do want to push us to remember our original goals and to return to those roots. And if you can't quite get there in your mind right now, I'm going to try to help you by being a little bit vulnerable. It feels a lot vulnerable, really, by telling you a little bit about my journey to becoming a bilingual teacher and how my colleagues pushed me beyond a bilingualism for all mindset. So I'm going to tell you a story that I don't believe I've ever shared aloud. I'm embarrassed by it. And it's all the more scary to tell because some of the colleagues I'm about to reference, albeit vaguely, are likely in the audience right now. So Flora, Melvid, Sylvia, Alejandra, Isabel, Monica, these women, these Latino women taught me such important lessons I didn't even know I needed to learn. So ladies, if you're here, I was listening. There are others of you in this room who also contributed to who I am and who I've become. Just because I didn't name you doesn't mean I don't hold you dear, along with the lessons you've taught me. Before telling my story, I want to acknowledge that we all grow and learn from where we are, and where I was when I began teaching was very different than where I am now, which is very different from where I'll likely be tomorrow. Each of you is in a different place, and I am inviting you to self-evaluate and to consider what your journey forward will entail. Again, Jose Medina reminded us we're all a hot mess. We all got places to go, right? I also want us to be able to admit our mistakes and to grow from them. I want us, if our colleagues aren't where we are, to show them grace and to practice patience. Many of us have made mistakes in our struggle to get this right. So in that vein, here goes. This is me at about 17 years old, spending my senior year of high school as an exchange student in Spain. At the time, I had completed only a single year of high school Spanish, and I could barely conjugate a verb in the present tense. I had never traveled outside of the United States. And even though studying in Spain required 2 years of Spanish studies, when I signed up for study abroad, I fought for the European experience. If you had asked me at the time if I were biased against Mexico, Central or South America, I would have denied it vehemently. But why else did I insist on Spain? Also, why did they, the company I went with, ask for 2 years of Spanish to go to Spain, but only 1 year to go to any other Spanish-speaking country? My life's experiences and the Western European-centric history I'd been taught had already instilled in me biases and an inherent way of thinking about countries and peoples hierarchically. It had happened subtly and over time. I'm sure my teachers didn't even realize the hidden messages they were instilling. And as I think about this, nearly 40 years later, I wonder the extent to which we still convey these hidden messages in the curricula we enact. When I returned from Spain, I immediately enrolled at CU Boulder. I was going to be a Spanish major with the goal of teaching high school Spanish. I was on campus at a time when we were building shanty towns to protest apartheid in South Africa, or holding sit-ins to protest CIA recruitment on campus. I was developing a social awareness that I hadn't had previously. I was waking up and seeing imperialism for the first time. And once things are seen, they can't be unseen. That critical consciousness that I began developing as a young woman would never disappear. I can't help but wonder what would have been possible had my teachers helped me to see those things sooner. In the end, I gave up the study of Spanish and ended up pursuing an elementary teaching license. I don't regret that for a moment. It's been my life's work. But while studying for that license, I randomly happened upon Escuela Bilingüe Washington, the very school Amy referenced at the beginning of this when she introduced me, in Boulder, where I had my first introduction to bilingual education. When I wandered in and began asking questions, I knew I'd found my place. Here was a Spanish-English dual language public school with controlled enrollment that balanced the demographics so that there were 50%, excuse me, of what we then termed Spanish speakers or Latinos. Let me take a drink of water, give me a second. And 50% English speakers or Anglos. I recognize now that all of the terminology is problematic, but that was our best thinking at the time. I was coming out of the CU School of Education where no one in my licensure program had ever mentioned bilingual education in a state, Colorado, that didn't yet have an endorsement in bilingualism. I knew nothing. So I had to make sense of it in my own way. And in my naive 20-something-year-old self's way of knowing, I couldn't see that societal inequities didn't go away at the schoolyard door. In the decade I spent at this school as a volunteer, a student teacher, a teacher, and a parent, I learned some humbling lessons. I entered thinking that bilingualism for all was a beautiful thing, and I still believe that. but I also entered thinking it was a panacea. And while it has potential, I recognize that we need to be careful and we need to be intentional. I thought everyone was on equal footing, that every student, because of his or her home language, would get to be a role model. I believed in a vision where treating everyone equally would actually result in equal outcomes. I didn't understand that even within our classrooms, despite our best efforts, some were still more privileged than others. But I learned. The ladies I mentioned earlier, my Latina colleagues, they knew, and they kept naming the inequities. I would go to faculty meetings and some of my Latina colleagues would remind us of our purpose. They would remind us that Latino children and families were depending upon us to get this right. And in my head, and this is the part that I am the most embarrassed about, I would get annoyed and I would think, Anglo English speaking families are depending on us too. My kids here, I'm depending on us. They would point out the hegemony of English in the hallways, on the playground, in our faculty meetings, in the loudspeaker announcements. They would raise issues about the blatant economic disparities between family groups. They held up mirrors to show us the ways we, educators, were reinforcing certain kinds of privileges, how the curriculum benefited some while denying others. And in the beginning, I thought they were exaggerating, or maybe even creating problems where none existed. Now, I see everything they saw, but they had to show me over and over and over. I'm embarrassed to admit. What they kept telling me and what I'm reminding you today is that some of our students are going to be fine no matter where they attend school. The system is stacked in their favor. They speak the language of status and power. Their textbooks affirm their identities. Our Latinx and immigrant families and students need us differently. We need to step up differently. They need us to stand with them to reimagine and reinvent the world in a different image. And so I reiterate and play off a riff that was repeated often this summer. Just like all lives can't matter until Black lives matter, or as Dr. Medina reminded us yesterday, until queer, trans, Black women matter, bilingualism for all won't be the panacea until we provide a liberating and justice-based education for Latinx youth. And this is where I call us to action. This is where we consider what a reckoning looks like for bilingual educators and bilingual schools. And if we are honest with ourselves, we know we can do better, each of us individually and all of us collectively. This is where I acknowledge again that we are exhausted, but we must keep moving forward from wherever we are. We can all do something. In the next few minutes, I'm going to name a few actions that come to mind, but I know they won't all apply equally to each of you, and that while I've missed, and I probably will have missed others that are important to you but didn't occur to me, some of them are quite small and others are going to take greater effort. Find your place in the dialogue. Commit to just one thing. I believe in the power of one person, one voice, one idea, one change. What's your one thing going to be? And if we all do at least one thing, imagine what our collective efforts could accomplish. Maybe it's as simple as insisting when someone proposes that you upend your literacy instruction to be sure you are adhering to the science of reading or structured literacy, you insist that they show you the evidence that what they are suggesting works for bilingual children, or that it works in the same way in Spanish. We all know that Spanish and English are fundamentally different languages. They need to be taught in ways that honor those differences. Does the evidence support applying structured literacy as it's been researched thus far to our bilingual programs and to all of the languages we teach? Maybe what we do is commit to pointing out that monolingual perspectives are dominating this dialogue, but that without evidence, dominating the dialogue isn't enough. Every time I hear someone pushing for a structured approach to literacy, they rely heavily on the fact that it is evidence-based. Please show me the evidence for bilingual learners. As our colleagues in Texas are asking, what is the science of biliteracy? My former colleague, Jeanette Klingner, was fond of reminding us we need to ask what works, for whom, and in what context. Show us what works for our students in our context. When you come to us asking for us to implement from a science of reading perspective, please be prepared to tell us what the research says about modifications and accommodations that should be included for bilingual learners. And if you can do that, I promise we'll be on board. But if you cannot, get out of our way. Again, we can all do something, even if it's just insisting that policymakers present evidence to support their claims. Maybe it's understanding that assessment systems are meant to provide insight into learning, not drive what is being taught. It's knowing and insisting that bilingualism has value beyond tests, and just because those creating the systems do not understand bilingualism does not mean we need to change what we are doing. I would argue that in many cases, we don't need to change, the assessment systems do. I've been around long enough to see that many bilingual educators acquiesce to the idea that if the test is in English, we need to sacrifice Spanish. The argument is that the children need to be ready for the test. This needs to stop. Our children need us to educate them in their own best interest for a world we can imagine, not the one that is. I know that it is a scary proposition that carries consequences, but ask yourself, who pays in the long run if we keep reproducing the world as it is? I believe it was Jesus yesterday in his opening remarks who said something to the effect of, we need to be teaching and planning now for 140 years from now. It's the 7-generation principle. We don't need to teach for the world that is. We need to change the world, upend it. Maybe what you have the energy to do right now is to insist that our students deserve more than they sometimes get in our programs. If you had a sign that looked like this in your yard this year, or you smiled when you passed a house with one in its yard, teach like it. We need to insist that science not be ignored in our curriculum. Bilingual education is not an excuse to do less. Our kids need science and social studies and civics. Not now and then, not when we can get around to fitting it in. They need it throughout their schooling, and they need it to be taught systematically and thoroughly. It's a way of thinking. It's applicable and relevant to navigating the world. Imagine how 2020 might have looked differently if our fellow citizens knew and trusted science, or if they'd had a better grasp on critical thinking and weighing evidence. Every day that you help children to develop these skills, you are creating a potential for a different future. We need to examine our curriculum and our pedagogies to understand where we can uplift and highlight indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world. I also recognize that we can't teach what we do not know. So maybe your action is to educate yourself. In a world where access to information is at our fingertips, maybe we can be just a little more thoughtful about what we are learning, what information we seek out. Once we've educated ourselves, we can change what's being taught in our classrooms. If we're required to teach legends, must they be Western-based? A legend is a legend is a legend, right? We can learn and teach that legends are traditional stories handed down from the past without using King Arthur as our example. If we must teach the idea of colonialism, does it have to be about the British and the US? And even if it does, can we introduce multiple perspectives and help students to understand the colonial legacies that continue to exist today? As we reform and expand our curricula, we need to remember that our Latinx students have plenty of windows into other cultures throughout the day. When do they get mirrors? What can we do to be sure our students know the history of the Chicano movement in this country? When do they get to read and analyze I Am Joaquin by Corki Gonzalez? When do they learn about their indigenous and African roots? When do they see the roles their ancestors played in the struggle for labor rights, land reclamation, educational reform? Must they wait until college, like I did, to know that the Aztec Empire was thriving at the same time in world history as the Italian Renaissance was just getting started? We need to examine the big ideas and the essential questions that we are required to teach and consider if there are missing perspectives, particularly perspectives that provide mirrors for the students in our classrooms. Maybe you have a little bit more energy. Maybe you're called to think bigger than your classroom, your school, or your district. Maybe you have an ounce or two of energy left to give back by providing leadership or volunteer hours. You could help out an organization like CO-CABE. CO-CABE advocates and educates on our behalf, but they cannot do it without volunteers. So how might you contribute your time or possibly your money to help CO-CABE work on behalf of all of us? And we have to think beyond the local. We need to influence national educational policy. This is not the time to take a wait and see approach. We did that with Obama. We were quiet with Trump. This is our window. We need to swamp the incoming Secretary of Education and the Biden administration with our concerns. We need to offer to be resources. We have to be willing to sit at the table. And if we're not invited, we need to insist that they make room and they hear our voices. We have a tiny window to have a huge influence. This is Dr. Miguel Cardona, President Biden's nominee for Secretary of Education. He is Puerto Rican by heritage and grew up in public housing in Connecticut. He is the current Education Commissioner in Connecticut and a strong advocate for public schools. We have an education person coming to the table now that we've gotten rid of Betsy DeVos. He is a former principal, teacher, assistant superintendent, and get this, his master's degree is in bilingual bicultural education. When he accepted Biden's nomination, he said, I, being bilingual and bicultural, am as American as apple pie and rice and beans. Let's co-opt him into our asset-based, justice-oriented vision. Let's start contacting him now. I would be so proud of us if on Dr. Cardona's first day as Secretary of Education, he arrived to 100, 200, 500 letters from bilingual educators in Colorado, helping him to understand why what we do matters, why what we do is critical to anti-racist education in service to a more just world. We can do this. And I know that we have very little time and so very little energy to spare. But despite this, I've tried to build a case for change and for activism, for us to look back at our roots, to remember our fight for a more just world. I know you have not one extra minute in your day, but I also know that CO-CABE has scheduled me to lead a breakout session following this talk to continue the conversation. And here's what I can promise you if you show up. I will stop talking. I want to hear from you. I do not intend to give a presentation, and I have no preconceived ideas about the agenda or the outcome. It'll be a casual conversation led, I hope, mostly by you. In many ways, I share some of the traits that Nancy Cummins brought up in her session yesterday, who reminded us how hard it is to give up control, to have an hour and 15 minutes and not like have an agenda. We're going to walk into a room together and talk without guidance or an agenda. And there's a little piece of me that's terrified by that. But when I feel that discomfort, I try to remind myself to lean into it. I will ask you to share the issues you feel are the most pressing to you as educators, administrators, scholars, researchers, parents. I'm inviting you to come to the table. And I'm hoping the CO-CABE representatives will come into the space to help us know how we can help them. I didn't warn them ahead of time, so who knows, they're probably all busy. If you are a leader in any capacity and want our help, please come share with us the ways we can be involved. Together, we can brainstorm our next steps. I don't know who will be in the room, maybe no one, and that'll be okay. But my hope is that we can use a single hour of this conference, not just to plan, but to act. So I'm going to hold the last 20 to 30 minutes of the breakout as a quiet time for us to begin to compose those letters to Dr. Cardona. You won't need to find time later. You can do it while you're here today, this morning. Let's welcome him and share our vision and expectations with him. And let's let him know we're watching. And if right now isn't your moment, that's okay. Use this conference as a way to replenish your depleted resources, to gain inspiration and ideas. Just being here, just being present is already a demonstration of your commitment. And so I return to where I began. Let's reclaim our roots. And as you go back into your classrooms and your schools, channel Corki. I implore you to advocate and educate as if your survival depended upon it. Let's lead the reckoning. Let's do what we do while holding a vision of a more just world. Our roots can only serve to fortify our growth. I invite you to join me in fighting for the world our children and all of us need and deserve. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this magnificent conference.
Thank you, Sue. And our breakout sessions will begin at 9:15. And don't forget the plenary session at 3 o'clock. It's also a call to action. Might be our theme for the day, Dr. Hopewell. Thank you.